I'm sitting here today with Matt Barnes, a Colorado-based conservationist, owner of Shining Horizons Land Management, and Rangeland scientist. Now, Matt, with all those titles, how would you describe what you do?
So mostly I work on human livestock carnivore coexistence. And a lot of that is keeping cattle alive and not killed by predators. I've done some of this in Montana and Wyoming, and we'll probably end up doing some of this here in Colorado in the future. But yeah, I work with ranchers, and I spent most of my career working with ranchers in one way or another. Um, and in the last decade, that's been a lot about working with ranchers in places that have animals like wolves.
And with your working with ranchers so much, do you have an opinion on the recent wolf introduction here in Colorado?
Yeah, I try to see this issue from multiple perspectives. So, as a range scientist, as a wildlife conservationist, as a former ranch manager, I support ranching, I support hunting, and I support wildlife restoration. I think we can have all of those things. They're not necessarily in conflict with each other, but sometimes there will be conflicts on a smaller scale. And we need to deal with those in ways that make sense. And so, for example, in the stakeholder group that CPW convened to discuss these issues, we did our best to figure out how can we implement the will of the voters, bring back this native species, but do it in a way that minimizes conflict potential with livestock producers.
All right, and so now
So
staying with the ranchers here, we've spoken to a lot of ranchers here on the western slope, and they're concerned about wolves attacking their livestock. And now you've spoken about working in other states like Wyoming, I know has wolves reintroduced. Can we predict how the 10 wolves released so far and others released in the future will impact Colorado ranchers in the present and then again looking towards the future?
so yes and no. Science is a game of trying to predict things, but it's always an imperfect game. As we say, all models are useful. All models are also wrong, or all models are wrong, but some are useful, I think is the usual way of putting it. So yeah, we can. Our best predictions are based on looking back at the history of wolves and livestock in North America, but also especially looking at what's happened in the Northern Rockies in the last almost now 3 decades since wolves were reintroduced to Greater Yellowstone and Central Idaho in 1995. And what we've seen there is that yes, some wolves do kill livestock. It's actually a minority of wolves overall. About 1 out of every 5 wolf packs is known to kill livestock in any given year. So yes, it happens. And the important thing is addressing it when it does. Um, Now, most ranches don't lose any cattle to livestock in most years in the Northern Rockies. It is not the thing that keeps most ranchers awake at night. That ranching has bigger problems than predators. But in some places, it can be acute, it can be repetitive. We don't fully understand why some operations are more vulnerable than others, but we can make some guesses. The important thing is that when situations like this develop, that we approach them in ways that make sense. We've got both lethal and non-lethal methods for dealing with conflict. In CPW's plan, they say that non-lethal preventative methods will be encouraged and explored before lethal, but lethal control is an option if conflicts become severe.
Yeah, and so you talk about these lethal and non-lethal options. I know the 10J rule here does allow ranchers to use that lethal force, but what are, for some of our non-ranching viewers here, what are some traditional non-lethal techniques ranchers can use to protect their livestock?
Yeah, there are actually several, and CPW has a publication out now that shows what many of them are. So there are things that I would call tools and things that I would call strategies. So the tools are things like the devices. So fox lights, things that make light and noise, or something called fladry, which you may have seen put up around a cattle pasture that isn't it. It basically tries to keep wolves out, and all of those devices work at least on a small scale and for a short time. It's also important to understand that they all rely on novelty and on wolves being sort of afraid of new things. So that means that the effect will wear off over time if you use them too much. But they all work in the right situation. It's very situational. Now, strategies are more like how does a person manage a ranch in a way that makes it less vulnerable to predation pressure? Or put it a different way, we have tools that are focused on the potential predator that try to keep the predator and the livestock separate, but there are also strategies that focus more on the livestock and figuring out how to make them less vulnerable or more likely to survive an encounter when it eventually happens. And that can be anything from what kind of animals do you have in the first place to selecting for ones that are more locally adapted to how you plan your grazing management, things like livestock handling practices that can all support the natural defense mechanisms that cattle have, which are staying in a herd and having all their cows in a short time because cows are the most vulnerable age class. So it's ways to manage an operation that reduce its vulnerability that I think should be the primary focus. And then we can use those other tools that I mentioned, like the light and noise devices, when it makes sense.
So now moving over from ranching to hunting, other concerns we've heard here on the western slope are that hunting deer and elk, that reintroduction of wolves may impact that. Now when we look at these other western states that have introduced wolves, how has that impacted the deer and elk populations in those states, and what can we predict for Colorado?
Well, believe it or not, Michael, the wolf population does not appear to have had large scale impacts on elk in the northern Rockies. In fact, Montana and Wyoming have significantly more elk today than they did when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. And Idaho calls this the second golden age of elk hunting. So now, if you look at a finer scale in those states, you can find places where elk populations have gone up and places where elk populations have gone down. The fact of the matter is, by and large, those populations are regulated by state wildlife agencies through elk hunting. We are the apex predator almost everywhere that humans and elk overlap, except for national parks. So predation pressure is a real thing, but it's not what drives elk populations. And if you look in Yellowstone, and I'll use Yellowstone as an example, not because it's representative of the entire landscape, but because it's the most studied place. Wolves generally make a living on elk that are either very young or very old, but generally not really contributing to the reproductive success of the elk population. So the average age of elk killed by wolves is much higher than the average age of elk on the landscape. In contrast, when we go out and hunt elk, we typically kill animals that are in their prime. So that's a significant difference. The other thing to consider is we already have mountain lions and black bears. In the northern Rockies, there's a lot of evidence that mountain lions are the actual apex predator of elk. We always seem to think it's wolves, but really it's probably mountain lions. And in Wyoming, wolves have actually caused, they've killed a lot of mountain lions, and so the lion population may actually be going down. The big losers from wolf reintroduction are going to be mountain lions and coyotes, most likely. So that's really interesting. We don't know what the total effect of predation pressure of the entire suite of native predators will be. It's not necessarily the case that it's going to increase just because we added another predator. That would be the intuitive answer, but we don't actually know that. And so my guess is elk hunting won't change a whole lot. But if you look in northern Rockies, the one thing you do see is that elk land use patterns have shifted over the last few decades. So wolves and other predators do seem to have an influence on how elk use the landscape. They probably do move around more. There may be parts of the landscape where predation pressure is high enough that elk then start to avoid those places. So that could be good or bad, depending on the local specifics. That there's really not a single answer overall. But by and large, I hunt too, and personally, I think there's something more aesthetically interesting about hunting elk in a place where they're also hunted by wolves than in a place where they aren't.
All right, and so now kind of looking at the bigger picture of the gray wolves as a species, how is Colorado's reintroduction of gray wolves compared to other states? And will this ultimately, Colorado's efforts here to reintroduce gray wolves, will this ultimately help them as a species?
Oh, of course it will. I think if you look at the conservation community, the long-term goal for restoring wolves in North America, it's probably not to restore them every place they were historically. Historically, they were throughout the continent. In the western United States, it was gray wolves. In the eastern United States, well, in the northeastern United States, timber wolves, in southeastern United States, red wolves, Mexican wolves are a kind of gray wolf. I think the conservation community would say now that the goal is to have wolves throughout the Rocky Mountains. So an interconnected metapopulation from northern Canada all the way down to the southwestern United States. Uh, I think that when we have a self-sustaining population in Colorado, the Southern Rockies, and there's some connectivity to the Northern Rockies and perhaps eventually to the Southwest, I think that is the conservation community's idea of success. And it's not just about restoring the species, though. It's about restoring the keystone ecological process associated with that species. So restoring predation pressure by a coursing predator is similar to the idea of restoring fire to Western landscapes. You know, a process that people, particularly European Americans, over the last century or two, have really struggled to come to terms with. We completely eliminated it for many decades, and now we're faced with the inevitability of bringing it back. And there's growing pains with that. It's not always straightforward. Now we have some mega fires, we have some prescribed fires that get out of control, but in the long run, fire is going to be part of these systems one way or another. And I think the same can be said of predation by wolves and other large carnivores.
And so I just have one more question here. And you know, you talk about reintroducing and getting these wolves that span across Rocky Mountains. But when we have states like Wyoming, I saw you quoted in other articles where the southern parts of Wyoming have these almost kind of kill zones where lethal force is used and almost these breaking points. I mean, wolves have a lot of enemies in Colorado as it seems so far. I mean, how likely is it that we actually end up with this huge connectivity of wolves that spans the Rocky Mountains?
That's a great question, Michael. And I think the reality is eventually that connectivity will happen. There will be wolves, but the reality is also that not all of those wolves are going to live long enough to die of old age. People are going to kill some of them. I hope that most of them get to live long lives doing wolf things, just like I hope most cattle get to live long lives being cattle. But I know that none of these animals can be expected to live out their life forever without facing mortality. And I think that people who hunt and ranch kind of know intuitively that death is a part of life in the way most of us don't really think about on a daily basis. We've sort of gotten to live in a bubble where we all get to live long and die of old age, and that's a great thing for us, but it's not nature's way. You know, I mean, nature isn't always pretty, but she sure is beautiful. And I think the more we can get our minds around that, the better. So yeah, and you mentioned Wyoming. Wyoming's policy is a really interesting case in wildlife policy in the modern West. Most of Wyoming, including all of the southern part along the Colorado border, is what they call the predator zone. In that area, Wyoming is actually trying to prevent wolves from getting established there. And effectively, that has prevented wolves from recolonizing Colorado on their own. I suspect that if that policy weren't the case, Colorado would already have a wolf population and not be doing a reintroduction today. So that said, I think eventually it will happen. And certainly some wolves will leave Colorado and go into Wyoming, and a lot of those wolves will probably get killed there. Now, I think that's unfortunate. I think we should have policy focused on removing the wolves that are involved in conflict and letting the rest be. I would say a live and let live approach is better. It's never good for wildlife when they're completely protected on one side of an invisible line and completely subject to human-caused mortality on the other side of that line. They don't understand that line is there. But Colorado's plan basically is the basis of Colorado's plan is live and let live. So if the wolves aren't involved in conflict, let them be. If they are in conflict, respond to that conflict. And if we need to, we'll remove some of those. I think that approach would make sense across the West.
All right, well, Matt, I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us here on the Western Slope. And hey, for the rest of you guys, stay tuned. We got more news coming up right after the break.